Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is Become a Community Naturalist series with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and it is part of our summer learning program for teens and adults. And I'm pretty excited about this one. If you come all summer to each of our sessions, you can get your certificate of completion and a special button saying that you are a community naturalist. We've got more information about it over here, some other recommended reading on the topic, and I hope we see you all summer for this. Thank you for coming.
Okay. So my name is Sofiane. I am an AmeriCorps with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and I specifically serve within the Fisheries Division. So I am focused on aquatic invasive species, but you're probably going to see me talking about a bunch of other topics this summer. So let's just jump right in with aquatic invasives. Okay. So just to begin with the boring definitions, right? So a native species is something that is indigenous to an ecosystem. It has its niche, it's supposed to be there, it has a job that it's doing, and it's part of that whole web that kind of keeps that ecosystem stable. When a non-native species moves in, it also finds a niche that it can occupy, and it does this to various degrees. So sometimes we have an aggressive species, which becomes an invasive species. Other times we have something that gets introduced, such as the game fish that are introduced by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks for our recreationalists and our fishers. And those become introduced species. And we say introduced because they don't specifically have a negative impact on the environment or the economy or any other point in time where they're bad. We do keep a close eye on them, but they're simply outside of their natural range. And then, of course, we have invasive species, which are causing environmental, economic, any type of harm that they're inflicting. Oftentimes, it's both economic and environmental, which is always a delight. So this is an audience participation part. Get you guys talking right off the bat. So what do you all think? The American bullfrog, is it native, introduced, or invasive in Montana? Anyone? No wrong answers. Invasive? So it is invasive. These guys are particularly invasive, and I feel like that photo kind of sums them up pretty well. Anything that they can fit in their mouth, they are going to eat. Their natural range is represented in that dark purple. They have spread to all those areas in pink, including Montana. We have several eradication efforts through FWP and through other organizations that partner with us, as well as I believe the tribes are leading their own eradication efforts, and they've done an amazing job with that. But bullfrogs are notoriously difficult to get rid of. Okay, rainbow trout. What do you think? Introduced? It is mostly introduced. So there is that little portion of the Kootenai River that we do have native rainbow trout, and then the vast majority of them are introduced, again, as a very popular game fish. We call it introduced because there are no harms that we've seen so far. Snapping turtles. This is the last one that you have to talk, I promise. What do y'all think? Introduced? So these are tricky because they're invasive in western Montana, so here they're invasive, but in eastern Montana, they are not. And that is the unique part of living where we are. We have that continental divide that extends down our state. And so a lot of species that are native to western Montana aren't native to eastern Montana and vice versa. So when we have that human traffic that brings different species over that divide that otherwise wouldn't be able to transport themselves, crayfish are not going to be cresting any continental divides anytime soon unless we take them places, which we do. So 5 traits of an invasive species. So this is what makes an invasive species successful. They can have one or all of these. If they have all of them, that's bad. That's going to be a very problematic species. We do have different degrees of invasive. I'll get into that a little more later, but things can be worse than others. So they tend to grow fast, they reproduce quickly, they spread easily, particularly with human methods. So there's something about them that makes it easy for us to transport them. They're tolerant of many different environments, especially when it comes to pollution. And then they outcompete other species using these or a whole host of other adaptions. So to give you an example, we're going to compare zebra mussels and then one of our native mussels, which is the western pearl shell mussel. And to preface this, freshwater mussels that are native to the US are actually the most endangered animal that we have in the United States. They're pretty, most of the species I think at this point are endangered. A lot of that has to do with environmental pollutants. And then it also has to do with them being harvested earlier on for their shells because they made really nice buttons or jewelry or any other host of things that we harvested them for, and like freshwater pearls. That's not really a great economy, so we dipped out of that pretty quick. But they did suffer for that, unfortunately. So zebra mussels, as you can see, they can reach adult size within a year, and they have a short lifespan. That compares to western pearl shells, who have quite a bit longer lifespan, 60 to 70 years, and with that, they also take a lot longer to become sexually mature. So when you have species that take longer, that gives an invasive species a really good opportunity to sneak in there, reproduce really fast and a lot, such as the zebra mussel, which they can produce like 1 million little larvae per year, which is a lot more than the pearl shell mussels, which might not even reproduce every year. Spreading easily is one of the zebra mussel's best traits. So first off, they have a planktonic stage, which is when they are invisible to the naked eye, and they're free floating during that time. So that means that if a little zebra mussel planktonic stage, which we call veligers, so if a little zebra mussel veliger gets introduced into a river, it's going to flow down the river with that current until it gets large enough to become a settler. So it becomes settled at the bottom or on a surface, and that's where it will continue to grow and then reproduce, and then the next round of veligers goes down the current. So that's one way that they're able to really effectively spread. Another way is that they have byssal threads, which is kind of like little shoots of duct tape, and they use that to attach to artificial surfaces. And so that includes boats, boat propellers, pipes. I have an example over there that you can take a look at during the break, but agricultural pipes and other infrastructure pipes, they are a big issue for a lot of the states that have them. It takes millions and millions of dollars to just clear them off of water plants, agricultural pipes, anything that needs to be flowing. So that leads to increases in energy costs, increases in agricultural costs, and then it also makes recreation pretty unpleasant, which I will also get into a little bit later. And then as a bivalve, they're desiccation resistant, which means that they are able to resist being dried out. And that's because they have those two sides of their shell and they can just close up and outlast probably about 5 days if it's not too hot, not too cold. If they are partially submerged, like if you have a boat that hasn't been completely drained, they can last for up to 30 days or until it goes dry. On the other hand, pearl shell mussels do not have a planktonic stage. They require a fish host. And the little planktonic, they do have a planktonic stage, but it's not free floating. So they attach to a fish host. Usually it's a west slope cutthroat trout, seems to be their preference here in Montana. And unfortunately, those trout are on the decline. They are a species of concern. So they have fewer and fewer opportunities to reproduce successfully. And they also do not have that critical byssal thread. So if you see an attached mussel or an attached bivalve in general, anything that has a shell and it's attached to a surface, please let us know. We would very much like to know about that. And finally, zebra mussels are really good at tolerating pollution, as opposed to Western pearl shell mussels, which are not. They are very sensitive to pollution and disruption.
Can I ask where zebra mussels originated?
That is an excellent question. Give me just 1 second, and the next slide will answer you. So this is just a size comparison between juveniles and the adult Western pearl shells, and then some of our invasive Asian clams. Currently, we don't have a large population of these, but we are on the lookout always for new populations. This photo is of zebra mussels attaching themselves to one of our native mussels. So as you can see, they can attach with those byssal threads to invertebrates. Recently, we saw them attached to a fish, not here in Montana, but elsewhere. So they can definitely have a really bad effect on whatever they've attached to. So before I get into specific species, I just wanted to kind of expand upon the food web. So when we have an invasive species, we have to look at what place it occupies in the food web. So if it's a low level, so just to begin with, we have the sun, which feeds into primary producers like plants and phytoplankton. And then we have primary consumers that eat the plants and phytoplankton. Primary consumers are a really important stage in the food web. They feed a lot of our fish larvae, our big fish, the ones that we love to fish for, and that keeps Montana going in terms of our recreational economy. And then they also have zooplankton. So instead of phytoplankton, which are plants, the zooplankton are tiny little animals. So we have phytoplankton and zooplankton. When we have something like an invasive mussel occupies the primary consumer level. And so instead of eating a fair amount of phytoplankton, but not all of it, like our native mussels will, zebra mussels will come in and literally clear the water. So if you are familiar with the Great Lakes at all, they have great visibility in the Great Lakes now. They did not 30 years ago. And that is because our zebra mussels came in and just ate all the phytoplankton, all the particulates that were in that water, and left nothing else for the other primary consumers. So now we're going to your question, which is where are they from? They are from Eastern Europe, near Ukraine, and they came to us through ballast water. So they arrived at the Great Lakes in the mid-1980s. And ballast water is taken in by cargo ships when they don't have any cargo. They take it in from wherever they're starting. So in this case, they started off somewhere near Ukraine. They took up water into their hull. That kept them balanced as they crossed over. And then they picked up cargo here in the Great Lakes. So they emptied out all of that ballast water. And in that ballast water were little planktonic forms of the zebra and quagga mussels. And that is how they emerged in the Great Lakes. And then from there, they were transported across the US by us humans, either in their adult stage when they were able to attach to boats and other types of watercraft that we handily ship over into different states just for them to spread. Or they had their little planktonic stage where they were able to slip into standing water or more ballast water. So zebra and quagga mussels, by the way, are very similar species, but they are two distinct different ones. So habitat-wise, we see them a lot in slower moving water. We don't worry about them in some of those rushing, rapid waters. So if you do see us surveying lakes and streams more often, or notice that our inspection stations tend to be clustered around lakes and reservoirs, that would be why. And as I said before, they outcompete native mussels. They can attach to native invertebrates and basically become so much of a problem for that individual animal that they can no longer feed themselves or move around. And then they filter all that phytoplankton from the food web, and then they cause massive issues for our sorry, I forget the word, for all of our pipes and our power plants and everything else that requires moving water or just clean pipes. The estimated cost to Montana would be $234 million each year to just mitigate the effects of zebra and quagga mussels should they establish an invasive population. Currently, our preventative measures that we have established through the fisheries department is 3% of that. So if anybody ever comes up to you while you're out educating your community about aquatic invasive species and says, why are you taking up all the tax dollars for the inspection stations and for all the surveying that we do? Remind them it's 3% of what we would be spending if we actually had an invasive population. This is the difference between them. As you can see, there's a bit of a size difference and a bit of a color difference. They're both bad. If we get to the stage where we're having to identify between the two, things have already gone terribly wrong. And then this is the size difference between them and our native mussels. So again, if you're ever wondering, is this thing that I am looking at a native mussel or an invasive mussel? One, you can always take a picture and send it to us. Two, if it's large and it's on the bottom, such as like just on the sand or the mud or kind of buried in there, probably a native mussel. If it's attached to something, it's definitely invasive. Rusty crayfish. And I will be going through the rest of these pretty quickly, but if you'd like the slides for this, just let me know. You'll also get a field guide, so you'll have a lot of this information for yourself. Rusty crayfish are a very large and aggressive crayfish. They tend to outcompete native crayfish and also lead to hyperpredation by larger fish on native crayfish. This is because rusty crayfish are pretty aggressive, and they also have very large claws. And that makes them very unpalatable for a fish who could instead just go and eat the little signal crayfish, which is one of our natives, that doesn't have those big claws and isn't as ready to fight everybody as the rusty crayfish is. And so that leads to more predation pressure on our native crayfish if these are introduced. So far, we have not found them, and we did do a really awesome crayfish study that was over the past couple of years, and we're pretty thrilled that we haven't seen them, but that doesn't mean they're not here. American bullfrogs. As I said before, they are here. They will eat literally anything that can fit in their mouth. That means ducklings, bats, small birds, other frogs, native frogs, other bullfrogs. They just don't eat enough other bullfrogs for it to be a self-solving problem. That would be great, though. I worry that it would turn into this thing where it's like the biggest bullfrog wins and then they start coming after us next, you know? So these look very distinct compared to our other native species. If you come back for our freshwater series, I will be showing you some of the other native species that we have. Bullfrogs are pretty distinct, and also they're much larger in their adult form than any of the other ones that we have. New Zealand mud snails. As you can see, they're from New Zealand and they like mud. This is a problem especially for waders. That's where they really enjoy getting around on felt bottom waders especially, but boot waders are also a problem. Even hiking boots, if you're walking along the shore in an area that does have New Zealand mud snails, they just get embedded in the grooves and in everything that is just compacted in there. And then they go wherever you go. And because they are also desiccation resistant, so they can tolerate being out of the water for 5 or so days, we have to make sure that we're either keeping our gear in the sun for longer than 5 days in between switching bodies of water, or we are scrubbing everything off at the site and making sure that we're not transporting anything out. And they are tiny. You are not going to be able to catch these very easily. So again, that's why we encourage people to just go ahead and clean their gear, assuming they have little mud snails and plants attached and whatever else. Clean as if you are already infested. So what about plants? So I think plants are often ignored when it comes to educating about aquatic invasive species, but they can have just as big or more of an effect on especially enjoying recreation on water bodies, because it makes them impossible to access. This is an image of a lake that has been taken over by water lilies. And as you can see, there's not a lot of opportunity to go and stand up paddleboard or kayak or boat. This also limits how animals and waterfowl can use the lake. So all of that on the shore is limited, so they aren't able to access the lake. There can also be submerged aquatic invasive plants, which lead to entanglement. We have a couple plants in the US. One of them is hydrilla, which we do not have in Montana. We are very proud of that fact, that have been associated with potential drownings or near drownings because they are just such an entanglement threat. They're also very much a threat of entanglement for boat propellers and any of those watercraft, which makes them easy to spread because they get stuck up in there. So what are we doing in Montana? So we have a three-pronged program. We have early detection, we have watercraft inspection, and then we have outreach and education. Our early detection folks are the ones who go out and survey all the water bodies that they can. We have a map that has an algorithm that shows us where the areas of highest risk are. And so that usually takes into account the number of out-of-state boats that we see, the number of boat traffic versus foot traffic, these types of risk factors that we can quantify. And so they'll prioritize those, and we try to get as many places as we can, and then we continue to check up on the progress if we do find invasive species. We have many ways of doing that. Waders are one of them, snorkeling is another. And we also have a scuba team, which is super effective for some of those invasive species that prefer deeper areas. Our watercraft inspection stations, you have probably either been inspected or driven past an inspection station. They are doing an awesome job of just checking all of the out-of-state boats and then all that interstate traffic that we have, and making sure that nothing is being transported out of specific areas. We definitely don't want things coming in from out of state that we don't have here, and we also don't want things that are in Flathead moving to Fort Peck, for example. So far we've intercepted, I believe, 25 mussel-fouled boats this season, which is a matter of months. And it's certainly up from last year, but we are thrilled that we're catching them. So, and then outreach and education, that's me. I'm in charge of outreach and education. That's why I'm talking to you. So we have two primary campaigns in Montana. We have Clean, Drain, Dry, and then we have Don't Let It Loose. And Clean, Drain, Dry is fortunately catching on in multiple other states. So we try to present kind of a cohesive message, which is clean. Before you leave whatever site that you just got done recreating in, clean all your equipment. Clean your dog, clean your horse. Clean literally anything that went into the water or around the water in case of hiking boots. I just got done hiking around water looking for crayfish for y'all. I found none. But before I left, I just went and scraped down my boots with a little boot scraper, and that's all you really need to do. You can bleach your boots if you're feeling up to it. You don't have to unless you know that there's an invasive species that is susceptible to bleach and that you know is probably on your gear. Draining, we remove all the water from the equipment before we transport it. We pull the plug if we have, the plug in our boats and our kayaks. And then we remove any standing water. And why would we remove standing water? Any ideas? Yes, because we could have those veligers or those planktonic stages of these invasives that need water, right? So these are all aquatic invasives. If there's no aqua part, they're not going to survive for very long, which is why dry is so important. We recommend at least 5 days between water bodies if you're just leaving it out to dry in the sun. If you do have to switch between water bodies sooner, go ahead and get in there with a towel and just dry as much standing water as you can and make sure that there's nothing that you can see visibly. And we do say that for all watercraft. For example, stand-up paddleboards and kayaks, you do have to stop at the inspection stations and get that stuff inspected. I was just at the inspection stations recently, and we had a kayak come in that had snails on it. So it can happen even if it's not one of the fancy motorboats. And then don't let it loose is a very simple message. Please do not dump your aquarium plants or pets into the local waters. Even if they are native, they can have diseases that they acquired in the pet trade that would then be introduced into our waters. So even if you have a viral crayfish, those are native to Montana, but we still don't want them introduced. Goldfish. This one was found in France. And that is a very clear issue of why we don't want people to release their pets. Goldfish are carp, they can get enormous, and they eat everything. Time to do that activity. So I'll give you guys like 5 minutes to get up, walk around, ignore me for like 5 minutes, and then you have to listen to me again. But the activity basically, don't look at the back. You're gonna try to guess, just from reading the adaptations, what section you think your animals go in. So think about what we went over. I'll back up to adaptations. Think about that type of, these types of trends. What is your animal? Does it have any of these adaptations? Does it lack them? Just your best guess. There's no grade. I will not judge. Cool. Thank you for your attention. We'll reconvene in 5 minutes. Okay, so community science. This is what all of y'all are here to learn about. Community science, also known as citizen science. The verbiage just depends on current perceptions, I guess. We are opening it up from citizen science to include community science just because we don't want it to be based on citizenship. And we also want to be focused on communities, right? Because we are part of a community here wherever we live, if we're in Missoula, if we're in Lolo, if we're just in the Montana community, and we have our local ecosystems that we're trying to protect. And I personally consider like my ecosystem part of the community. It's not just the human portions, it's also the native species that we have, the native ecosystems, like the waters that we have and all of that. So let's talk about science. So science is a systematic study, and it's observations of the physical and natural world that we look at through experimentation, observation, and testing. So when we have questions, we turn them into theories, we turn them into hypotheses, and we look for evidence in the natural world through a system. So the key to doing science is to have some sort of system that you're using, such as just recording data, or just something in your mind. It doesn't have to be as formal as keeping notes on everything. It can just be like, okay, I'm going to go and look at this area today. And I'm gonna go and compare the leaves on these different plants and see if I can tell which one is native and which one is invasive. Science does not have to be the perfect scientific method. This is a really good point to go off of, just so that you can imagine new ways of applying it to your life. So we start with that observation or question. So we see something, we say, what is that plant that's in the water? We research the topic area, such as getting a field guide from the FWP person who is currently at your library, who will be handing out field guides. And then we say, okay, maybe it is a type of pondweed. Cool. We test that. So we go out, we collect our specimens, and we compare it to either our field guide, or we bother Craig, who works at FWP, who's really good with plants, unlike me, and I text him often with my plant questions. And you can too. And then we analyze that data, right? We say, okay, have we looked at the different comparisons? Have we consulted with an expert? Do we feel comfortable with what we've reached with our conclusion? And then maybe we have new questions. Maybe we find this new curly leaf pondweed that it hasn't been reported in this current watershed. And then that starts a whole process over again. Or we switch to a different plant, or we start looking at crayfish. Just depends on what you're interested in. Anybody can do science. It doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter how young you are, it doesn't matter how much money you have, it doesn't matter how much equipment you have. Is equipment nice? Yeah, it can be very nice. but I'm an AmeriCorps and I don't have equipment. So I can go around and I can just wade through the waters, and wherever I'm at, if I'm at a Flathead Lake, I can just go and look at the shore and see what's washed up. That's one of the best ways to look for invasive species. It's one of the best ways to look for native species, just seeing what is in that little water line. Binoculars are fun, but you can also see birds with your eyes. It might be harder, but there's also binoculars that are available for borrowing at many of our state parks, as well as I think the library, which is super cool. Field guides, which are also accessible because I'm going to be giving you them, and they should be available at the library soon. I'm working with the librarian to get that established. And then a bunch of other things. You can choose how much money you invest in this, community science endeavor, in whatever hobbies. If you get into birding, birding is one of those hobbies where you can spend a lot of money if you want to, but you don't have to. And I will talk more about the ways that you don't have to with birding and other things when we get to apps and resources. But in the meantime, let's talk about data, everybody's favorite topic. So the most important thing that I think you should remember about data is that you can always compress data. You can always make fewer notes, but you can never add to it. Especially, well, at least you usually can't. Usually when you're like surveying crayfish, for example, you go out, you measure them, you make all your notes, and then you go back to the office and that specimen is gone and it's back doing its life. However, if you suddenly realize, oh shoot, I should have been recording the color of their eyes, I don't know. whatever weird thing that the scientists want us to record now, it's too late, right? You can't record that. So try to think about what questions you're going to be asking and what questions you might be asking in the future, even if you're not asking them right now. So one of the things that we saw when we were doing our crayfish survey was we were recording species, we were recording, basic notes about size, but then we were seeing all these lesions on these crayfish. And we thought, that's weird. Are all of these crayfish just being injured, or are they being predated upon by something? And then we started seeing it more and more at different sites. And it turns out it was crayfish plague, which is, Montana is one of the first places in the US that it's been observed to be symptomatic populations. Usually crayfish our North American crayfish are carriers, but they're not symptomatic. That was a problem because we spread it to Europe and their local crayfish and pretty much eradicated their native crayfish populations. And then we said, oh no, don't worry, we'll help you sustain your crayfish population by bringing in more of our crayfish. And that just made things worse because we didn't realize it was crayfish plague at that point. So sometimes science is a little behind. But because we recorded those lesions, even though we didn't quite know what they were able to go back in that data and say, okay, all of these places that we visited before, these all had lesions. So we could include that in our data set. Photos. Photos are key. Do not zoom in. I made that mistake a lot early on. When you zoom in, especially on your camera or on your phone camera, it decreases the detail. I don't know the technical words for it. That's a tech question. But if you take a really good photo with, focusing your camera on the object, you can zoom in quite a bit afterwards. And that's actually a higher quality image. You can also borrow a camera from the people downstairs, which are awesome. And you can use one of their cameras that have awesome zooms that don't decrease the quality. You can use a camera attachment. You can use a magnifier. If you have if you have $5, there's a bunch of kids' toys that have magnifiers on them for when they're looking at bugs. Those work for adults too. They're really fun, and they come in cool colors so you don't lose them in the field. Use a plain background when possible. As you can see with that middle photo, it's kind of hard to see the scat because it's intermixed with all the foliage and the grass and all of that. It's still an okay photo. It was enough to see what type of scat it was. It's still not great. And then the furthest photo is a plain background, And that's one of the better examples of how to take a photo of like snails that you find, is just have that plain background, make sure that we can see which way the shell is twisting. And then if you're really fancy, you can have one like on the far, I guess it's the left for you guys, where you have a super zoom magnifying, this is probably under a microscope, since these are the New Zealand mud snails, because they're tiny and annoying. So, photos, remember them. There's a lot of really cool guides online that you can find, especially through some of the apps that I'm going to talk about, that give you really good pointers on different, like how to photograph different species. So if you're photographing birds, they give you tips on what are the identifying features that you need to capture when you photograph birds. They do that with fish and mussel or mollusks, which includes snails, mussels, all that. Insects, butterflies, all of that. So when you're out collecting and looking for stuff, let's talk ethics. So if you think you've found an invasive species, you are welcome to collect it, especially if you're pretty confident in your identification, or if you're just like, okay, I can't take a good photo of this. I really do think it might be an invasive species. I'm just going to go ahead and bring it. There's multiple ways to bring it in. Talk to me if you're planning to collect after this, and we'll just talk about multiple methods. Avoid collecting or disturbing sensitive species whenever you're out doing community science. One of these sensitive species is going to be owls. Oftentimes people interact inappropriately with owls. Owls are particularly sensitive to having their day roosts disturbed. So if a bunch of people hear about a really cool owl that's hanging out and all rush to go and see the owl and get really close to it, it can disturb that owl and make it fly away and have to find a new day roost, which is an energy expenditure, right? And wild animals have a limited energy expenditure. So when we're thinking about how we're interacting with animals out in the wild, we want to make sure that we're not making their lives harder. We're not making them have to expend more energy. We're not taking fish all the way out of the water or handling them roughly or throwing them back in the water roughly. We're making our intrusion on them as minimal as possible, and we're leaving the ecosystem as good as we found it or even better. One of my favorite things to do when I'm out there is I just grab a little doggy bag from whatever, trailhead that I'm at, and I just go and pick up whatever trash I find along the way. If you find the little party poppers like I did last weekend, I'm so sorry. It's going to take hours. It was miserable, but you feel very accomplished afterwards. Apps and websites. So this is the fun stuff. So Seek by iNaturalist is an AI-assisted app that will usually identify at least to a general family or genus, even if it can't get that exact species. And that gives you a lot of flexibility on how you're going to ID it from there. For example, it has trouble with spiders, but usually it can get down to a very close group that makes it significantly easier to leaf through all the spiders. It's also great with plants. If you cannot find what you're looking for on Seek, you can go to iNaturalist. And the nice thing is that they are made by the same company. So iNaturalist runs Seek, and you can post directly to iNaturalist from Seek. So if you can't get an ID, you can post onto iNaturalist, and what happens then is a bunch of nerds who treat iNaturalist like a social media site are going to be going through, and they're going to be looking at all the pictures that people are collecting, and they're going to be like, oh, well, I'm a plant specialist. I know what that is, and then they give you an ID. And sometimes they argue amongst themselves about what ID it is. It's fine. Just let them go. They have fun. We'll let them have fun. But it's a really cool resource. If you're not already on it, I recommend joining up. It also has a map feature, which you can just see what people are finding in your neighborhood. It's super cool to just see what people are discovering. Merlin Bird ID is a really, really cool app, especially if you don't have binoculars or if your binoculars aren't great. It is basically, if you've ever used the app Shazam for songs, it listens to a bird and it can usually tell you what bird that is. It's really, really cool, kind of like magic, at least to me. And it also has a feature where you can go through and look at all the local birds. So if you kind of see a bird, you know the identifying features, but you're not sure which one it is. You know, if you have a big guidebook and it's all of North America birds, and you're like, well, which one is actually in my area? It will show you down to your location. So that's really fun too. eBird is basically the iNaturalist equivalent to Merlin. eBird is how you log all the birds that you see. So it is a data collection. So when you're out there birding, you can keep track of all the birds that you see, and it goes into a big database, and it is a really, really cool, just citizen-run, community-run data database that a lot of researchers rely on to see trends in birds. It exploded during the pandemic when everybody was looking for an excuse to go outside. And so it's become even more important for us. And the same goes for iNaturalist. All of the coworkers that I have at FWP, we all keep an eye on iNaturalist and see what people are finding. We do look for people who are reporting invasives. And it's a really big asset to us because even though we have our early detectors out there on the ground, they're not able to be everywhere at once. And then we have Montana Fishes, which is a really cool app as well. That app is just going to be basically a mobile field guide. So that is going to help you identify fish. And then these are the organizations that also have community science opportunities. Glacier National Park in particular runs one that's really successful. They have a loon project hooked up through them. I am spearheading a crayfish project. And then the Montana Natural Heritage Museum is also a cool one to get involved with. If you have any questions about these things, email me and I can get you in contact with people. If you're feeling gung-ho about AIS detection and crayfish, email me. I will get you covered and we'll go out and we'll do some field work and get you comfortable. I realize now that it doesn't end at 7. It ended at like 6:30, right? Okay. Okay. Totally forgot. So cool. This is all I have for you guys. Ask me questions. Come get your field guides. We have invasive species up here, and then freshwater aquatic plants. And the freshwater aquatic plants have a little scale on the back. So that'll be helpful. I also have crayfish posters that kind of show the collection that we've had from the River Mile data. They did a really big survey of the Columbia River basin, and that is actually run by mostly students. So high school students have gone out, and one of them actually discovered or two of them actually discovered an invasive species that hadn't been detected in Oregon before, and now they are published authors for a scientific article, and I am incredibly jealous of them. So I'm going back to this so that I have it up for y'all so that you can see. Let me know if you need the apps as well. And yeah, that's all I got for you. Thank you.